Welcome everybody. I'm very happy to see so many people here for the Danish Council for Research and Innovation Policies Conference on New Trends in International Science Policy. The task of the Council for Research and Innovation Policy is to provide the Danish government and the Parliament with high-quality research and innovation advice, including an understanding of the international trends and development in the field. The Council views the ESOF 2014 in Copenhagen as an excellent opportunity to get inspiration about new international trends in science policy. The opportunity to debate new trends with key stakeholders from around the world is unique. Today we are looking at science policy making, and the need to address societal challenges and the needs of society in this perspective. We hope that this session will give us all inspiration and reflection to think, develop and implement science policy in the future. We are recording the session, and a summary will be made available at the website of the Danish Council for Research and Innovation Policy. The PowerPoint presentation from the three speakers will also be available at the Council's webpage. And if you use Twitter, you can use the hashtag ESOF-Pol20. You can see it on the projector. And now I would like to welcome the first speaker, Sir Peter Gluckman. Professor Peter Gluckman is the Chief Science Advisor to the Prime Minister of New Zealand. Professor Gluckman has worked in pediatrics and endocrinology. He has published more than 500 refereed papers, 150 reviews, and authored both technical and popular science books. He's the inventor of over 30 families of patents and has been the founder of several biotech companies. He's also the Chief Scientific Officer at the Singapore Institute of Clinical Sciences. He holds a number of honorary positions in New Zealand and internationally. In 2009, he was appointed the first Chief Science Advisor to the Prime Minister of New Zealand. Professor Gluckman, we're looking forward to hear your presentations on science diplomacy.
Minister, friends, ladies and gentlemen, in general, diplomacy aims to promote national interests on an international stage without inducing conflict or negative spillovers. So how does science, which tries to be relatively values-free, interact with this clearly very values-laden set of political goals? And that's what I'm going to try and describe in the next 10 or 15 minutes. I think you'll find a lot of commonality between what I'm going to say about the science diplomacy nexus and what Mark will talk about in the next speech in the science policy nexus. The links between science and diplomacy have been described classically in three categories, which were first articulated by Nina Federoff, I think, who was the former president of AAAS and Chief Science Advisor within the Department of State in the Clinton era. And it was encapsulated in a report released by the AAAS and by the Royal Society about 5 years ago, following a meeting at Wilton House. And Nina described the interactions as either being in terms of diplomacy for science, science in diplomacy, and science for diplomacy. And while they're a somewhat simplistic categorization, I'm going to use those to frame the first part of my talk before showing how more nuanced it really is. So diplomacy has long played a role in assisting science that crosses national boundaries. It's most evidently seen in the raft of bilateral agreements that every advanced country has between states to support science exchange in various ways, and in the development of a number of global science projects, such as CERN, which is now 50 years old, I think, the International Space Station, the Square Kilometre Array, or the Antarctic Treaty, which led to the Antarctic research programs, which I'll talk about later on. Perhaps one, and there's more and more of these international science collaborations of different forms. And they're not always involving infrastructure. And I want to give you an example of one that doesn't involve infrastructure. And that's the Global Research Alliance on Reducing Greenhouse Gas Emissions from Agriculture. This was a New Zealand-led proposal that developed on the side of the famous Copenhagen climate change meeting in 2009. New Zealand recognised that it was unique amongst developed countries and that over 50% of its emissions were associated with food production. This is a pattern which is more like developing countries, and we felt that New Zealand could take the lead in being a force for change in this sector, which might encourage more of the developing countries to get engaged in the climate change discussions better. So we proposed a global alliance led by scientists to identify research gaps which might lead to mitigating agricultural emissions on the basis that we could engage a lot more countries. We invited a number of countries to join this initiative. In 2010, at a meeting in New Zealand which I co-chaired, some 30 countries agreed to join the initiative, and it's now over 40 countries, including all the big agricultural emitters, including both developed and developing countries. The initiative has been developed with very light-handed governance and with a very productive research effort under ways to reduce livestock emissions, methane emissions from rice, crop and arable land emissions, and to deal with the whole vexed issue of managing soil carbon. And key to the early success of this initiative was one. The diplomats created the initiative. They were the ones that negotiated and worked through the nutty issues of how you get trans-jurisdictional activity when most countries only want to spend research dollars within their own jurisdiction, and then they got right out of the way and have left it to the scientists to work on it. Now this is a classic example of diplomacy for science, about building international relationships to foster robust collaborative scientific networks, shared expertise and infrastructure. And we've seen this time and time again, where the tools of diplomacy have clearly helped the scientific enterprise. But if you reflect on the examples I've given, such as the Square Kilometre Array, the Global Research Alliance, CERN, there's been a reciprocal effect of science on diplomacy. For example, there's been no doubt that the Square Kilometre Array has met a number of objectives for enhancing North-South relationships and technology uplifts in Southern Africa. There's no doubt that that was a major part of the decisions made of where to site the array. On our part, there's been no doubt that the Global Research Alliance for Agricultural Greenhouse Gases has been an enormous doorway for us in relationship with building relationships with a large number of countries which we would not, as a little country in the South Pacific, normally engage with. Thus, diplomatic objectives can be met by using science policy tools, all while advancing collaborative science internationally at the same time. Indeed, if you think about it, the recent impetus on science within diplomacy started at the beginning of this decade when the US, Europe, and the UK looked towards how they could use science to build better bridges, particularly into the Muslim world, to cross cultures and try and get to something that could work across societies independent of other issues that might be in play. So I've talked about diplomacy for science and science for diplomacy. There's a third category of activity, and that's when science provides technical knowledge to meet diplomatic or trade objectives. That is science within diplomacy. I'm not going to dwell on this, but let's just say that without assessment and regulatory science, arms treaties could not exist. Verification requires science. And I'm certain that when the world finally gets to an effective mitigation approach to climate change, similar demands on the global science system regarding verification and measurement will become essential. So, as I've tried to illustrate, while the interaction of science and diplomacy can be categorised in these somewhat three artefactual categories, we're finding essential nuances that mediate these relationships. And indeed, with anything, context and perspective important. A country typology may be too simplistic, but we do know that there are important distinctions between large and small, developing and developed countries, and between countries with larger strategic industrial influence to countries like my own, which has little. It goes without saying that the large developed countries have long used science as a way of projecting themselves globally. But today we're seeing smaller countries like New Zealand borrowing from the same playbook and adapting it to their own gestalt. One area where this is most pronounced is in innovation. And let me give an example. The Small Advanced Economies Initiative brings the only non-European advanced economies with populations less than 10 million, there are only 3 of them, Singapore, Israel and New Zealand, together with 3 European partners, Denmark, Finland and Ireland, to explore policy development in science, innovation and economic policy. This initiative was born out of the recognition that there are small economy particularities that play out in the science and innovation sectors and are not accounted for in the conventional OECD G20 kinds of analyses. This network is proving particularly valuable to policymakers in the 6 countries and has led to some very distinct insights and new sources of collaboration. And for us in New Zealand, it's brought us into partnerships we would not have thought of just 5 years ago. And as innovation-based economic growth becomes the centrepiece of many countries' growth strategies, the role of science in that setting has become more obvious. It's clear that countries want to project themselves as a source of innovation. Thus, many countries have started to appoint scientific attachés to many of their embassies, particularly in Asia, and we've seen the development of scientific and innovation networks between governments. For example, I co-chair the Asia-Pacific Economic Council, which comprises 21 economies in the Asia-Pacific Rim, including both China and North America and the United States, for a meeting of chief science advisor and equivalent meetings every year, which focuses on matters of common interest in developing the innovation and economic agenda. Among those things we're learning through this analysis is how the link between science and trade can be particularly acute. Science has sometimes been exploited to create trade barriers, which means particularly that small economies can become particularly vulnerable at the nexus between science and trade. Think of the examples. The questions about the use of bovine hormone-treated meat. Is that a scientific issue or was it an artificial trade barrier? Genetically modified organisms may fit into the same category. The issue of use of pesticides or wood preservatives. Talking to the World Trade Organization, it's surprising what a high percentage of trade disputes are actually based or solved on the basis of scientific claim and counterclaim. And we've underestimated how important science is in the trade disputes. Arguably the longest standing trade dispute in the history of the planet went on for 8 decades between 2 alleged friends, Australia and New Zealand. And it was a fight about the export of apples from New Zealand to Australia, which was blocked for 8 decades on the basis of a claim that there was a risk of an insect incursion into Australia of something which would destroy Tasmanian apples. After 7 decades of diplomatic attempts to solve it, it had to go to the World Trade Organization dispute system in the end to be resolved. We couldn't resolve it on the cricket field or the rugby field, which would be a normal way of resolving disputes. And eventually, on purely scientific grounds, the WTO ruled in favour of New Zealand based on scientific assessment of risk and risk management involved. I think we're going to see more and more of this issue of science and trade as the world globalises its trade system, and unfortunately some countries will tend to use arguments about science to create restrictive practices. But science And another example, which I think is now emerging, and we have currently before the WTO, is the whole issue of plain packaging of cigarette brands to try and improve global health and reduce tobacco consumption, something which is acutely on our agenda. But science can also help reduce national tensions. For example, a very tense relationship developed in the 1980s between the United States and New Zealand because we banned nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed warships from New Zealand, something the American Navy was not happy about. It's a dispute that only got finally resolved in the last few years. But it was in the meantime the joint activity in the Antarctic between New Zealand and the United States that maintained a far greater interaction between our two countries than the politics on the surface would have allowed. And mention of the Antarctic brings up another core role for science and diplomacy. Think of the world's ungoverned spaces. Space, the deep oceans, at least the Antarctic polar region, I won't comment on the Arctic, and the cyber world, the internet and the cyber world. To the extent these worlds are governed at all, they're really governed by scientific collaboration and consensus. And indeed, this is most obvious in the Antarctic Treaty, which restricts the use of the white continent to scientific purposes alone. But now let me look forward, because the climate change story heralds a future for science and diplomacy. Just as science is informing policy in different ways, it's engaging differently and more intimately with diplomacy than it's traditionally done. For instance, national interests are clearly at stake in developing global climate change mitigation strategy, as each country positions itself according to domestic pressures. And it's complex. But if we look at the matter somewhat dispassionately, we can see that since the emergence of the science-led climate change dialogues, governments have come to recognise the global nature of the problem. And while the science continues through the IPCC process to become increasingly clear, the problem of how to encourage governments to avoid a potential tragedy of the commons also becomes clearer. Both the science community and the diplomatic community have faced a number of new experiences and approaches, and the difficulty of solution finding is clearly very painful. And these kinds of issues are going to get more common and possibly more complicated, whether it's the risks and benefits of geoengineering on one hand, or attending to the quietly urgent issue of honeybee colony collapse on the other hand. There's a growing list of grand societal challenges that need a transnational policy perspective and are grounded in science. And as this grows, it's also highlighting an important weakness that we must all consider. There's an inchoate relationship between national science advisory systems, themselves with varying degrees of maturity, and those of transnational organisations, which in general are not very explicit. This is not a topic I have time to go into today, but will be a major topic on the topic of the first global meeting on science advice to governments, which will happen in Auckland, New Zealand in August this year. And interesting, that meeting's been preceded by meetings precisely on science and diplomacy. The final issue I want to raise before the chairman throws me out is the issue of the growing science and technology gap between the developed and the developing nations. In our case, we're particularly concerned about the small island developing states. While science has long had a role in aid, and indeed there's a whole science of aid, less attention has been given to how to build capacity in small countries to produce and use science for maximal benefit. Can digital means be used for distributed learning models to enhance STEM education or to create niches for economic growth in these marginal economies? A deeper challenge is how countries such as ours, with more experience in these areas, might assist the use of scientific advice in developing countries in ways that honour their domestic knowledge and sovereignty. As the world gets more technologically intense, this issue could become as problematical as the economic disequilibrium between North and South. The knowledge and science divide could be as big as the economic divide. And I think we need to find new ways through this. So, in summary, I think science and diplomacy are increasingly intertwined, and there's a challenge on us to recognise that science can help diplomacy as much as diplomacy can help science. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm sorry to be so tough, but I'm on the strict instructions that we have to finish by the time that was stipulated, and that means that each speaker is allotted 15 minutes. Now, I will introduce to you our next speaker, Professor Mark Walport, who is the Chief Scientific Advisor to Her Majesty's Government and the head of the Government Office of Science in the UK. Previously, Sir Mark was the director of the Wellcome Trust Foundation, which, as you all know, is a global charity foundation dedicated to achieving extraordinary improvements in human and animal health by supporting the brightest minds. Before joining the trust, he was a professor of medicine and head of the Division of Medicine at Imperial College London. He has been the member of the Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology since 2004, and we are looking forward to listen to your contribution today about science advice. Please, Professor Walport.
Thank you very much indeed. So just in case you think that chief scientists are commonly medics, I think Peter and I are actually rather unusual amongst the cohort of chief scientific advisors. I must say, there are plenty of battles between apples and pears, but I wasn't aware of this major war over apples before. But I would entirely agree with everything you've said about diplomacy, and particularly your distinction between diplomacy for science and science for diplomacy. And I think in the same way, people sometimes confuse scientific advice because there is policy and advice for science, and then there's science and all of the role that that can play in terms of advice across the whole range of government policies. And I think that's the main part of my job as the UK government's chief scientific advisor. But I would also reiterate the point that Peter has just made, that there are many occasions when scientists can open doors that politicians may not be able to because of conflicts in other areas. And I think this is a very underestimated aspect of diplomacy. So the job of the Chief Scientific Advisor in the United Kingdom is to provide advice to government on all aspects of science, engineering, technology and social science for the whole of government policy. So it's a sort of narrowly defined job. And what is it that government cares about? Well, I would argue that good government cares about two things. It cares about the health, the well-being, the resilience and the security of its population. And it cares about the economy, because, of course, those two are intertwined. And that, to a significant extent, sets the agenda for chief scientific advisors. So on the one hand, it's about how we bring together science across industry, academia and government to get the best policies so that we can gain the most from our very strong science bases. But what is it that underpins our health, our well-being, our resilience and our security? It's something that we take for granted until it goes wrong, and that is our infrastructure. And that can be divided into our built, engineered, technological infrastructure and our natural infrastructure, by which I mean health, human health, animal health, plant health, and the environment, so climate and weather. And of course, that's why climate and energy feature so strongly in discourse about scientific advice to government, because these two are so strongly interconnected. But the job of scientific advice in government is, wherever possible, to underpin policy with the best evidence that is available at the time. There's an additional important role, which I'll say a little bit more about, and that is the embedded possibilities that science has in government science advice for providing advice at very short notice in emergencies. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And then I think there is a role for scientific advice in government, not in advocacy for particular areas of science, but in advocacy for the role of science in terms of good policy making and good government. And so these are some of the things that need scientific advice. So the whole challenge of our built infrastructure, energy, transport, the built environment, waste, all of these things which we take for granted until they go wrong, but you've only got to look around the environment and you see the effect that we have, that science and engineering and technology has on our everyday lives. And maintaining and modernizing our infrastructure requires constant scientific input. The economy I've talked about and emergencies, and I'll say a bit more about them. But there's also the question about how to give advice. So there are a certain number of things that we learnt at medical school that are quite useful in terms of giving scientific advice, but they didn't necessarily teach you in medical school about climate and weather and energy systems. And so the job of a scientific advisor is actually to find the best scientific expertise wherever it is and to have the embedded mechanisms to do that. So firstly, in order to give advice, you need to have access mechanisms. And so my job is to advise the government. I directly report to the Prime Minister and to the Cabinet. And I'm assisted by departmental chief scientific advisors. So pretty much every government department in the UK has its own scientific advisor, and he or she provides skills in that area. And it means that between us, we have the whole array of scientific domain skills. So there are engineers, CSAs, physicists, statisticians, the whole range of people that you would expect and hope. There's then, and Peter's already talked about one acronym, which is Science and Innovation Networks. The acronym for that is SIN, but SAGE is a rather nicer acronym, and that stands for Scientific Advice Group in Emergencies, which I can convene at very short notice when things go wrong. There is a Council for Science and Technology, which is the top-level group that advises the Prime Minister, and then I'll say a bit more about foresight and horizon scanning. But even that network is not sufficient, and the challenge is to reach outside government to, for example, the learned academies, the Royal Society, to our universities, to public sector research establishments such as the Met Office, to academia, to industry. And so to provide the best scientific advice, you need the best network of advisors. And a lot of the job of a scientific advisor is actually brokering that advice, bringing the right people to the advisory table. And I think it's important to emphasize that good advice to government requires all of the sciences, and English doesn't have the right word. German does, I think, Wissenschaft, which really does bring together all of the scholarly subjects, ranging right from the physical sciences through to the humanities. And all of that is needed. So let me just give you some examples of the importance of having an embedded mechanism for scientific advice in government. And this is on the right of this slide. You can see a string of emergencies, both international and national emergencies, that have demanded an embedded mechanism. So pandemic flu. What does a country do to prepare, to handle? And one of the things that we have in the United Kingdom is a national risk register. And the purpose of a risk register, of course, is to prevent things happening wherever possible, to mitigate them, to handle them, and then to clear up afterwards. In 2010, the question whether the volcanic ash coming from the volcano in Iceland, was it safe to fly planes through it? In 2011, Fukushima. You might say, well, why was that the concern of my predecessor as the government chief scientist? That was because we have a responsibility to UK citizens living in other countries, and we needed to be able to provide advice through our embassy in Japan to UK citizens living in Tokyo. In 2012, a lot of work was done to prepare for the Olympics, but fortunately, the good security, all of the preparation work, meant that there was no substantial emergency, and that's an example of thinking ahead, foresight. At the beginning of, in 2013 and the beginning of this year, I had to deal with 0.5 metre of rain falling on the southwest of the UK and all of the flooding that went with that. And if anyone can tell me what's coming in the future, please let me know. But it's always easier to predict the past than the future. But it's just worth saying a little bit about Fukushima, because I think actually this is a good example also of science in diplomacy. Because the tsunami overwhelmed the reactor at Fukushima. There was a release of radiation, and the question was, what should UK citizens do living in Tokyo? Well, within a matter of hours, it was possible to assemble a group in Whitehall, which contained people that knew about the meteorology in Japan at the time, so they knew which way the winds were blowing, people who knew about radiation, people who could model plumes. And it was possible fairly rapidly to actually work out that for UK citizens living in Tokyo, the risks of the radioactive plume from Fukushima were negligible. And that advice was conveyed through the embassy, and I believe, and I've got a colleague from Japan here today, that that advice was useful not only for UK citizens living in Japan, but was useful for the population as a whole, because some other countries were advising their residents to evacuate, which was sending difficult messages to the Japanese population. So having that embedded mechanism ready to go, able to find the right experts quickly, is a really important tool. And similarly, in response to the UK flooding, COBRA, that stands, it's not a snake, it's actually Cabinet Office briefing rooms. It's a committee that's chaired by the Prime Minister, and as part of that, the government chief scientist comes along with relevant experts, and for the flooding, we had the Environment Agency, the Met Office, the Ordnance Survey, and of course, mapping underpins almost every emergency response. You need good mapping, industry, academia, and we were able to call on international expertise as well, so to host a meeting in number 10 Downing Street, bringing together flooding experts from the Netherlands and from the USA. And so you can look at the timescales of scientific advice in terms of, I've just been talking, and I'll start at the bottom of this slide, in the short term, the responsive. So that's about managing flooding, Fukushima, ash clouds. There are issues emerging scientifically all the time, the use of neonicotinoid pesticides, the issues of hazard and risk, bovine tuberculosis, Cholera fraxinea, ash dieback, and then medium-term issues where the sorts of issues that have gone through the Government Office for Science are energy capacity margins, the whole challenge of how we promote innovation, the whole issue of risk, where it was a pleasure this morning to be able to convene at the British Embassy a meeting to talk about risk in relation to innovation. Because if we are to deal with many of the risks that we face, we have to innovate. And yet there is always a danger that innovation is thought of as bringing a whole set of new risks. But the risks are actually symmetrical. If you don't innovate, you're exposing yourself to all sorts of problems as well. And I think we need a much better discussion about issues of risk, hazard, vulnerability, and uncertainty, because these terms are bandied about without a lot of work going into understanding exactly what they mean. And then it's also the responsibility, I think, of scientific advisors to look as far as is possible forwards, and that's the work of foresight and horizon scanning, which in the UK we do in conjunction with the Cabinet Office. And there we're looking at issues such as demography, aging, something that affects all populations, the future of cities, and we've recently been asked by the Prime Minister to do some work on the Internet of Things. And coming back actually to something else that Peter said when you were talking about the embedding of science in the sort of diplomatic process, one of the things that has changed the planet largely for the better is standards. And so how we think about how we're going to maximize the impact of the Internet of Things, we do need to have standards in the same way that the shipping container has probably done more for global economies than many other measures. And then, of course, so many issues, as Peter has said, are global, where science transcends boundary. We all breathe the same atmosphere. A solar mass coronal ejection will actually cause electromagnetic disturbances wherever on the planet it hits. We need to think about that, we need to prepare, and in order to do it, we need to share the best scientific advice. Issues such as antimicrobial resistance, microbes don't worry about customs, nutrition, and of course the large-scale scientific infrastructure such as the Square Kilometre Array. So space weather, I think, is a very good example. Most people have forgotten what's known as the Carrington event in 1859. But our telecommunications then wasn't quite as sophisticated now, and the planet Earth is now more vulnerable than it was to a major coronal mass ejection. And the electromagnetic radiation could damage satellites, it could damage communications on the Earth, it has the potential to disrupt electric grids and damage transformers. This is the sort of thing where we need to work internationally to get the best scientific advice that we possibly can. And my final point, I think, is about public engagement, because all of these issues require discourse between policymakers and the public. And I should say that the role of the scientific advisor is not to make the policy. It's to provide the advice to the politicians whom we all elect. They're the ones that have to make the decisions. And we also have to recognize as scientific advisors that they look through issues through all sorts of lenses, of which science is but one. It may be the most important in some circumstances, in others it may be relatively minor. And so in the case of energy, for example, the three lenses that policymakers have to look through are the security of supply first and foremost, then the sustainability in relation to the planet, and then issues of affordability. And any policy for energy that looks through one of those lenses alone is likely to run into some difficulties. But with all of these topics, we need to engage the public. And that's not about telling the public the right answer. And Tim O'Riordan, who's a distinguished social scientist who's doing a lot of work with the Government Office for Science at the moment, really makes these 5 points. Firstly, that when we engage on an issue such as genetically modified organisms, that we need to tell people that all of the potential alternative solutions are being looked at. It's not A only. It's about actually allowing decision-making at the appropriate geographical level. So it's not about entirely at one level, it's got to be done all the way down to different publics. And we have to recognize there isn't a single public, there are lots of publics. We need to involve the public in decision-making and not just leave it simply to the experts and regulators. We need to communicate, and communication is, of course, two-way, and we need to tailor those communications and to use trusted messengers. And finally, we actually need to engage people's emotions, their sense of responsibility, and actually their sense of pride in being able to innovate and host innovative functions and structures. So, to conclude, I would argue that an awful lot of government policy involves science and technology and engineering and the social sciences. It's quite hard to find any bit of public policy that doesn't in some way involve one or more of these. And I would just submit to you that science advice is not an optional extra, and that the real challenge for the scientific advisor is to be a very clear communicator and interlocutor between the scientific community and policymakers. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much, Mark. And in case you're sitting with a question or two, please do not forget them, because there will be a possibility after the next lecture and one contribution more to ask questions to all the lecturers. The third and last speaker of this session is Professor Flemming Besenbacher, who is a chairman of the Carlsberg Group and the Carlsberg Foundation. So in a way, he's the owner of the premises that we're at today. In addition to that, he's also professor at the Department of Physics and Astronomy at Aarhus University, a nanophysicist, and a member of numerous sports and scientific council, including the Danish National Innovation Foundation, established in March 2014. Flemming Besenbacher is the honorary doctor at 10 Chinese universities. I think it must be a record in Denmark. And he's the advisor to the Chinese government of Science Matter. Today, Flemming is going to talk to us about the subject I know that's very close to his heart, scientific social responsibility. Please, Flemming. In 15 minutes, please.
Thank you, Jens, and thank you for the invitation to come here today. And again, as Jens said, I can welcome all you here to Carlsberg. Some of you who's not been here a long time know that actually this was the home of the founder of Carlsberg, but actually Niels Bohr lived here for 31 years, from 1931 until 1962 when he died here. So actually all the great men and women of quantum mechanics have walked around in this fantastic room here, discussed quantum mechanics, and Heisenberg was here, as you know. Some of you have maybe seen a chance to see the fantastic play here. I'm going to cover the last topic of this session here, which is scientific social responsibility. Let me just try to step back a little bit and say that I actually believe that we are living in a world today which is where new has become normal. And that has influenced many, many ways in which we're looking at the world today. And I really think that sort of the way we look at the world today, also from university environment, is completely different than we just 10 or 15 years ago, also the way we are doing education. And maybe we have to reconsider many of the things we're doing at universities. Uncertainty has certainly become a new norm. Complexity is constantly increasing. The marketplace is certainly global today. The speed at which we are seeing changes is sort of higher than ever. We are all interconnected. If something happens in the globe today, then this will happen within a few seconds. We all know it. At this split second here, around 3 billion people on the globe are interconnected either by internet, Twitter, and email and so forth here. And then certainly we're also coming into an era now where resources are becoming more and more scarce. And that, in my opinion, calls in many ways for our society, in the business world, in the public world, but also certainly in the university world, to sort of try to break down the silos and think outside the box. We have to do things differently than we've been using before and try to see how we can do things faster and smarter. And the real challenges, which I think both was addressed before here in the two previous speakers here by Peter and Mark, is actually also, we are also living in a world today where we're seeing huge grand challenges. And let me just sort of point to the fact that we are around 7 billion people on the globe today. All indications are indicating that will reach 9 or 10 billion people. One simple question, will we be able to feed 10 billion people on the globe? Many places I just returned from China the other day. We have used to have a lot of water here in Denmark, clean water, but water scarcity will be an issue many places around the world. We have been living in an era where we have cheap energy, coal, gas, oil, that cannot continue on for many different reasons. But one of the reasons is that it cannot no longer be debated. We have the highest ever level of CO2 in our atmosphere, and I do not believe any longer it can be debated that the average temperature on the globe has been increased between 0.7 and 0.8 degrees. We can discuss a lot how that will increase in the future. We are seeing a demographic change. Many population will be an aging population. Will we be able to develop what I will call affordable health care here? Many minerals are becoming more and more scarce. There's many elements in the periodic system which actually are sort of running out. So there's really many issues here. And my message is that to politicians is that the only way we can tackle this problem is actually investing in education, research, and innovation. I mean, that will not be solved by the bankers who sort of screwed up the financial systems, honestly. I mean, it is calling for more investment in science, education, and innovation. And you can also make sure that this cannot be solved by New Zealand or UK or Denmark alone, or for that sake, within the Horizon 20. This is global challenges, which only can be solved actually by also having science diplomacy and science advice throughout the world. I think also that I will come back to this sort of scientific social responsibility, but I think innovation is also be a very crucial role in our society again. And I really also believe that sort of interdisciplinarity will be a key role in going forward here. And of course, I also firmly believe that it's not only a question about having innovation within science or medicine, but we also have to engage sort of the humanities and social science, design. I mean, when we all like to have an iPhone, that's also because it's great design and it's easy to use. So that's very important if you invent new things. And also art. So I think, again, sort of this breaking down the silos between the different disciplines is becoming to be more and more important. As Jens said, I was for 10 years the founding director of a nanoscience center at Aarhus University, iNano. And there I spent a lot of time breaking down the silos, fighting with the head of departments for physics, chemistry, biology, and molecular biology. And I think that by the end of the day, I convinced them that by actually having these people working together on a common platform, we could actually do things which neither the physicists, nor the chemists, nor the biologists could do. For example, one example, drug delivery from nanoparticles hitting specific genes as a holy grail. I think also that we are coming to an era now where it's actually the responsibility, because much of the research carrying on in universities is publicly funded. I think we have a responsibility actually to improve the research for the betterment of society and actually to help improving some of these grand challenges. And you see John Kennedy here, and you all remember some of his speech there saying that, do not ask what society can do for you, but what can you do for society? And I think actually the same question should be asked to many scientists around the world, and also for the vice chancellor of universities. Do not ask what you can do for Copenhagen University, but or the other way around, what can Copenhagen University do for you, but what can you do for Copenhagen University? Because we all have a responsibility as scientists. Try, first of all, to do basic fundamental science, but sometimes, if you see things which actually can help the improvement of the mankind on globe, then we have a responsibility of scientists to step up and making the bridge from the fundamental science into the more business world. If I look at the Danish research system here, I think actually Denmark is doing pretty well. If you normalize things, Denmark is all international standards are doing very well. Many papers from Denmark are well cited and so forth. So we are doing, I would say, above average compared to our size. And I think now we have a minister here and the government should be praised for the further investment in science and so forth in due time. But one area where for sure Denmark is not doing so well is actually building the bridge from the science into innovation, using this innovation to actually both strengthen the existing companies, but also building in new companies here. And there's certainly a big challenge here. And therefore, I think, again, the government should be praised for the fact that now we have established this new foundation, the Danish Innovation Foundation, which hopefully will have the goal as bridging this gap between basic fundamental science and more innovation things. And I think, again, these breakthroughs cannot be planned. You cannot have politicians sitting around the world that now I would like to develop a new solar cell with an efficiency of 40% or things like that. But I think also looking back in history, there's this what I call co-invention, because it's nearly always so that it's not the fantastic professor which get the bright idea. It's not the same person who then drives into technology. And we have been used to sort about the triangle here, education, research, innovation. But I firmly believe that if we are sort of having success in bridging this gap between the basic fundamental science and the innovation, then we have to incorporate the business world again. I am, again, strongly believing that university professors should actually concentrate on doing education, research, filing patents whenever it's appropriate. But then we should engage people who knows how to drive a business, because they're actually much better in doing that. And I would argue strongly against having university professors also having running companies at university environments. There's many people out there who know how to drive this here, and I think this private-public partnership here is actually one way forward, and we should improve that much more than we're doing today. And let me just give you one example of this here. It was actually Fritz Haber in Berlin who actually found the patent, who actually was able to make ammonia here by combining nitrogen and hydrogen in an iron catalyst here. But it was actually later on Carl Bosch at BASF which actually made this process here, industrial process. And again, this is also a process here where, for example, the Hallertopsø companies here today is producing a lot of the catalyst for this process here. But again, this is really a process also which is incredibly important for mankind, because this is the background for fertilizers. And I've here shown a curve which is the fertilizers consumption, but also the world's population. And we could not have 10 billion people on the globe today had we not had this simple process here developing fertilizers in the world today. So this is a fantastic scientific achievement. It was a good innovation here. It made a product here, but it's also a product which solved a lot of problems for our society. And of course, being here in Copenhagen and this fantastic room here again, I can think you take the Nobel model, the atomic model by Niels Bohr here, that was actually laying a foundation for the diode, the transistor, the integrated circuit. But it was then Gordon Moore who founded Intel and sort of was one of the persons driving the Silicon Valley, and we're all benefiting from that today when we are running around with our mobile phones and computers and so forth and can do these things. So again, an example of how actually sometimes a long time scale by basic fundamental science sometimes is helping in the betterment of science here. I'm also of the strong believer that this talk about basic fundamental science and applied science makes, to me, really no sense. We can discuss about good science and bad science, but the most excellent basic research are also, in my opinion, often those where you actually see also the collaboration with industry, where you see the patent being filed. And therefore, I think if we keep arguing about this bridge between basic fundamental science and applied science, that is not very fruitful moving forward here. And you can see this quote actually all the way back from Pasteur, You can read it yourself here, but he actually said it very clearly here that the science and the application are bound together like fruit on the tree which bears it. And that's, again, we have to realize going forward here. I really believe that sort of when we're discussing this scientific social responsibility, there's a tendency that you try to measure, what is the money coming out investing in university environments, and you can start counting the number of publications, you can start counting the number of patents, you can start counting the number of spit out companies. I don't really know if this is a fruitful exercise. I know that we sometimes would like to do it, but I really believe that sort of one of the core values of a university is to the fact that within a university you have both the education, you have the bright young people, you have fantastic research there, but also you have to have the knowledge exchange both with the public sector and the industry. And the fact that we have these three areas here interconnected and interrelated at the same physical space, so you can come there, you can talk to the young bright people here. It's the knowledge we put into their brains, which actually is maybe the most important thing, transfer of knowledge into our society. This is actually the best way to actually evaluate the investment of universities. That's actually to have both university environments which are open to society, which educate the next generation of people, and where you have this knowledge exchange. Again, excellence. There has been maybe a tendency that we have sort of said, okay, we have so and so many number of people going into master education, we have so and so many people going into PhD education, and I think that's fine for all societies. But I think we also have come to a stage now where we have to focus on the quality of these people here. And therefore, certainly, I think also we have to, at least for the certain fraction of universities, because universities have changed from being elite institutions to being environments where actually a fairly large fraction of the population goes to university. And there again, I think that if you sort of would like to focus on excellence, what does it really require to drive excellence? First of all, it requires talent, intelligence, it's passion, perfection, innovation. But we should never forget that maybe the most important thing here is hard work by the scientist. There's no free lunch here, and you can be a very smart guy or whatever, girl, woman, but if you're not able to work very, very hard, then it's very seldom that you actually are very successful. And I can just assure you that many scientists around the world, at least which I've met, they really realize that the hard work is very important. But I think it's also very important for university environment to nurturing the talents. And again, it's hard work within boundaries. University environments should define the excellent boundaries. It's given the right framework conditions. I think we should give them time and space to explore the talents here. But then I think again that professional academic leadership is very, very important. I think it is very, very important that actually we try to set up programs where we give young people freedom to explore their talents and not having them necessarily working in very large group headed by a senior professor. I still remember back when I got my first independent grant. This is a fantastic chance, and we should actually be much better in doing that and get out of the way of the young talents. Again, I think this question about academic leadership is more and more important, and we can have a lot of discussion what fantastic academic leadership is, but I think we are really calling for academic leaders who have the single-minded and firm ability to pursue quality and actually to pursue the international requirements. And I think there is a tendency that if you see some of these universities which is actually doing very best, they are normally also headed by outstanding academic leaders which have shown this academic leadership here. So I will end up here to just save a few minutes here by a quote from Darwin. I still think that we are living in a world today where we see huge changes at a very small time scale here. And then we should remember Darwin's work here, that it's not always the strongest species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but those most responsive to change. I think this is very important in our society today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Flemming. And now we are very fortunate that we can invite the first person to ask questions up here, being the Minister for Higher Education and Science in Denmark. Sofie Carsten Nielsen has promised to be what we have called a discussant. That is, you will make a few comments on what we've heard, and perhaps ask a few questions, and when Sofie is done, it'll be your turn. Please, Sofie.
Thank you so much, Jens, and thank you for the very, very interesting perspectives on how science has definitely an increasingly important role with regard to both policy making and maybe also politics. I think I'd like to just make a short comment on that, both nationally and definitely internationally, and also how it cannot be divided anymore. That's why I wanted to just touch upon the policy and politics, because I think all three of you were touching upon that, and it might be important to just make a short comment on that, because I mean, it's obvious what science can offer to policy making. I think that is generally completely accepted and legitimate. There's a big role for science. I think, at least politically, that is also very, very recognized. In terms of policy making, we might not always follow the advice, we might be really bad at it, but it's completely legitimate that this is a role for science and scientists. However, when it comes to politics, it seems, and this is one of your points, I think, Flemming, it seems science shy a little bit off there, and I understand completely why. It's dangerous and difficult life, but don't we need, and that's a question then, don't we need scientists to engage a little bit more, and can we distinguish policy from politics as much as we might want to do in the debate? I don't think so. And especially Mr. Walport, I was intrigued by your discussion on the different, how science can be exploited to create trade barriers, for example. Your many very good examples. But of course, I stand as a politician and say, well, but that's not just because politicians want to create barriers. It's because they want to take into account the feelings and fears of the population, and pretty much has to. That's our democratic responsibility in many ways as well. And might be that fears and feelings of general populations are created through push from industry, from lobbyists, but sometimes they are also just really difficult to change. And don't scientists there have, well, I'm quite sure you'll say yes, but can you exploit a little bit on how the scientists can have a responsibility in terms of really heightening the quality of the public debate, heightening the quality of the politics of it? I think we might be quite a few politicians who would actually really like that. I think, you know, in Denmark we really actively support the international participation completely across the board in all of the research work, and we really try to enhance internationalization. We have established our innovation centers many places in the world. And I think it also could be interesting to discuss how international science policy should be developed in the future. I mean, how can we internationalize even more? And how can we incorporate research and development in more policy areas, maybe? I mean, you came upon some of the very, very obvious ones, but Flemming, you touched upon the interdisciplinarity of it. Can we cross boundaries in more areas than the obvious ones, where the emergencies, these kind of things, natural catastrophe? I think that's obvious to many people, even if it doesn't work always. And another important aspect, if I may, you stop me, Jens, when I can't speak anymore, is how science can interact, and I think that's much of your, more with society's needs. That's probably also, I mean, connected to my first point, because I think it's obvious that you can help enhance the quality of the policy making and the discussions, but can you also I mean, I was intrigued by the science diplomacy discussion. Can you also enhance our ability to scan the periphery, probably, and make long-term decisions in that sense? That would be really, really interesting to get your perspectives on more areas of that kind, because it's so uncertain. We can predict even less than we used to, but science should be able to help us anyway. But most importantly, the distinction between policy and politics, I think, to me, that's quite interesting. Might not be to you, but to me it is. Thank you.
Could I ask the speakers to come up here? The three speakers to come up here. And there were lots of questions to all of you in Sofie, Carsten, Niels' speech already. So I don't know. Peter, would you start first by responding to some of the questions that were addressed to you, perhaps?
Well, the Minister has rightly picked on a lot of the issues which people like myself and Mark reflect on a lot. And I think part of the problem and the challenge he gave to us is it depends on which scientist and which role. In my view, the science advisor has the problem of maintaining the trust of at least four constituencies: the politician, the policy maker, the public and the media, which I regard as one, and the scientific community. And that requires that the science advisor put some boundaries about what they do. And their boundaries are to transmit the range of options which Mark talked about, based on knowledge and assessment of the knowledge, acknowledging that the policymakers and the politicians have different roles, and adding in the values-laden dimensions of fiscal values, public reason, social license, and so forth. Now, that doesn't mean the science advisor is not cognizant of those things and doesn't engage in them, but it's how they do so and maintain the trust is difficult. Now, for academic scientists or scientists in a different role, they can choose to play a different function to the science advisor, but they do so acknowledging that they may not sustain the trust of all four of those groups in doing so. And it's a real tension, and one that's sometimes talked about is the science advisor a knowledge broker or an advocate. They must be a knowledge broker or else they will fail. The only other point I would make by handing it over is your last point about science and responding to society's needs. I think this is a fundamental shift that's going on, the relationship between science and society, which society as a whole has understood better than the science community in many ways. And I think while scientists will express the fact that they're responding to society's needs, have they fully accepted that society will help set the agenda for science? They must. And certainly in New Zealand, we've moved to a way in which we consult the public a lot in major areas where they would like the science community to move to. But in doing so, we've certainly faced quite an abreaction from the science community itself. So there's quite a lot to be done for the science community to understand that the old paternalistic way science was run, where scientists did their stuff and pronounced a set of factoids from on high, has been replaced by something very different, where the science is done is somewhat determined, increasingly determined by society, and must respond to society's needs.
I think this is a very important point that all three of you mentioned in your lecture. I mean, this is the responsibility of the scientists to respond to society's need. You want to add something to this, Mark?
Well, yes, I just want to add something on the politics versus the science, which is the characteristic of a politician is that they have a democratic mandate. They've been elected, or in some cases they've been appointed, but through democratic processes. And people sometimes sort of look at me in a somewhat accusing way and say, well, look how few politicians there are in government. And what I always say is, well, that's not the fault of the politicians who are in government, it's the fault of the people that didn't stand. And so I would argue that actually the way you deal with science in politics is actually somehow or other to persuade more of the science and engineering and technology community to stand as politicians, because if they don't do so, then they can't complain from a political point of view if the decisions go the wrong way. So I think that's really important, but I think there is still a fundamental difference, which Peter's brought out, between being an advisor and being the politician who ultimately has the accountability before the electorate of making the policy decisions. You talked also about the quality of the public debate, and once again I'd say that the way we improve that is actually for more science engineers and technologists simply to get out there and do it. And I think that in a way goes to Fleming's talk, which is, as it were, to look very carefully at what the mission of scientists, wherever they're employed, is. And I think part of that is that science is not finished until it's communicated, and there are many audiences that need communication. One of them, of course, is other scientists, but one is the public at large. And since so much of their work is funded by the taxpayer, then they jolly well need to get out there and do it. So I think we really do need to do that. On the sort of barriers and the trade barriers point, there's a lot of areas where science can help, where actually there are no intrinsic trade barriers. So standardization is something that needs to be done by communities working together. It's not done something from the top down. And often it can solve problems that where there really is no political barrier at all. So I don't think that all of the barriers are necessarily political ones.
Fleming?
I think this link between science and society is incredibly important, and I fully agree the fact that, I mean, it's also responsibility of science actually to communicate what they're doing. It's not just enough to publish their papers in Science or Nature and then run away and say this has no implication for society. We need as scientists to step out and say, what can this have effect and how can we help solving some of these problems here? But I think also, as Mark just said, I mean, for politicians, I mean, they have, of course, this democratic mandate, and I can fully echo you saying that I wish that sort of more scientists would actually step up and become politicians. But again, as Sophia can probably agree with me, this is not sort of a trivial job to be a politician, and many scientists shy away from doing that. But let me just give you a few examples here where I actually think they make some decision which I wish could actually have done otherwise. I mean, take now the very tragic episode in Japan with a nuclear power plant there, and then look for Germany. I think Angela Merkel is a fantastic chancellor in Germany. She's actually a scientist, but actually shortly after this episode in Japan, suddenly she decided, for to me still totally peculiar reason, to close down all nuclear power plants in Germany. And I guess why she did it, I mean, there was a political pressure, there was a fear by the German population and so forth. And what has the result been? Germany is now burning more coal than ever. And that means that sort of on the CO2 level, I mean, what has happened there is just a tragic thing. Another issue, take GMO. For very, very sad reasons, Europe have lost all issues about GMO. There's no research on GMO here in Europe. And, you know, I mean, it's again the fact that scientists was not willing to stand up and argue for actually what is GMO. I've seen papers in Britain sort of say, I do not want to buy food which contain genes. You know, I mean, this sort of, I mean, honestly, you know, I mean, and, you know, I mean, this to me again say that sort of people from biology and others should have stood up and argued. And on the other hand, I think that my good friend, Sir David King, when he became science advisor, that was more basic the same time that this mad cow disease broke out in Britain. And actually there, I think that actually by getting analysis, getting hard facts, and then communicating these hard facts to the people in Britain, that actually de-escalated this conflict in a very short while. And I think at that time, that was really where I was sort of proud to be a scientist.
Well, thank you very much, Fleming. I was been told that in 3 or 4 minutes they're going to close the microphones because they're very strict on time here. So if I go to fulfill my promise to have at least one question or 2 questions from the audience, it's now. So please raise your hand, and there's a question over there. Please state your name first. Is it on?
I'm Frederick from the OECD Global Science Forum. Thank you for the panel for raising so many issues, which are also issues we are just dealing with at the OECD. I just wanted to pick one, which is, I think, very important in this international forum, which is the question you raise about tackling scientific advice in the context of global complex issues. This is obviously a challenge for many national scientific advisory systems, and they have to deal with very complex interdisciplinary problems which affect many countries, sometimes globally. And I was just wondering whether you had any ideas on systems which can help raise and improve the authoritative voice of national or international bodies which may provide advice. We have seen on climate change how difficult the IPCC's task was, even though their role was not to provide advice, but just assessment, and how controversial it can be because global topics obviously raise many conflicting interests. So my question is just, what are your ideas how to improve the role of international scientific advice?
And one more question. There was some hand over here somewhere. So there was, there it was, yes. And we answer both questions at the end for them.
Hello, my name is Boker Christensen. I work with venture capital and private equity and angels. My question is, how do we reinvent the university? Because we need jobs, especially south of Alps. And I guess US is kind of the market leader in all these areas of capitalizing innovation. I've been struggling working with the universities to get them to work together. I've been in a 100 million project just the last years, trying to get the 3 universities in Copenhagen trying to work together. It's very difficult. They are old institutions. They are very difficult to change old institutions. So what is your suggestions in reinventing the universities?
That was it. And you have 2 minutes to answer this very simple question. I'll start with Flemming and the other way.
We should only have 3 universities in Denmark. That makes things a lot easier. No, I fully agree with you that we have to reinvent universities, because I really believe that the way we have had universities, the way we're doing education today, was actually how the world looked for 10 or 15 years ago. And we have to do it. But I'm normally saying that universities are full of very visionary, very bright people, but they're also damn conservative. And that means actually that again call for academic leadership. And we have to do it, because if we're not doing it, then the students will actually just go away from Europe and go to somewhere else.
You're going to answer the same question, Peter, or the other question?
So, very quickly. I think one of the enemies of university reform is the academic CV, which is narrow in its focus and is an international culture. And until we look at how we get other outputs incorporated into the academic CV in a way from just nature, cell and impact factors, we've got a problem. And I think Paul Nurse and I spent a lot of time discussing whether the academies could take a lead in trying to look at a broader set of impacts within the academic CV. On the international one, I think you saw a development today, which I think is much more important than people realise. Namely, that networks of people providing science advice internationally get to talk to each other, because each of us has to work with our own jurisdictions. Ultimately, in the end, the climate change debate comes down to each national jurisprudence coming down to its own decision. The only way to help that through, not the only way, is for the networks, as was announced today for Europe, and which we're developing globally in the meeting in Auckland in August, is to have the community of people or academies or committees that who involved in giving advice to governments speaking a more common language.
So I think there's a common denominator to both questions, which is that the extraordinary revolution we're going through at the moment is the information technology revolution. And I think that offers opportunities both in terms of global collaboration, but also in the terms of the evolution of the universities. And I just say that there's one thing that's very important for Europe at the moment, which is how we use data to improve government policies, to hold things like health systems to account. And there's a very important directive that's going through Brussels at the moment, or regulation rather, the data regulation, which is extremely important because actually it could either enable a lot of what's going on or actually prevent it. And I think this is one area where science advisors do need to get together and to provide advice to governments across Europe just to make sure that we get the best of the data revolution whilst avoiding the obvious dangers. And I just end with one comment on privacy, which is a very hot issue at the moment. we tend to view privacy as a binary issue. It's either private or it isn't. That's not right. There are three analog scales that we need to consider when we're thinking about privacy in a digital era. One is the obfuscation of the data from complete anonymization at one end to completely open at the other. The second is a slide of access from locked in the Bank of England or the Bank of Denmark to open on the street outside. And the third slider is of regulation, legislation, and enforcement. And actually, we have to look at all three of those things. And rather open data in a very controlled environment is a very safe way of handling it. And so we have to, I think, to have a much more mature discussion about data and privacy. End on a non-controversial note.
Fleming, just very short.
I fully agree with this, and I really fear that Europe could end up in what I will call the DMO trap, actually, by not having this free access to data here. It's so important for our society, not least for the medical area. So this is really, at me, extremely important for Europe that we do this here correct.
Yes, I was told that we were granted 5 more minutes, and they already spent them, I think, in this discussion here. So I would thank you very much for a most interesting afternoon, and we all going to leave this room much more enriched in many thoughts in our minds. Thank you very much for good.